Today, we talk about how to dialogue with Muslims. A Presbyterian has questions about the church. And what about the Polish priest who came out as gay right before the Synod? This is Free Range Q&A with Al Cresta. Welcome to this episode of Free Range Q&A with Al Cresta. I'm Nick Tom, of course, along with Al Cresta, and Al's going to answer your questions from Facebook, Twitter, and email. That's freerange@avemariaradio.net. Let's get started. What do you say?
Sounds good.
Okay, Mary in Indiana says, you've asked us to evangelize by entering into dialogue with Islamic persons. Do we not take our lives into our own hands by doing so?
Yeah. You know, this is part of the problem of when an issue is multifaceted.
Yeah.
So right now, we have global jihadists. They are real Muslims,
Yeah.
and they are a significant part of especially the Middle East Muslim world. In America, we've got about as many Muslims here as we've got Episcopalians, we think. Now, I go into Dearborn, Michigan. It's probably the largest concentration of Muslims in the country.
Right.
I go there regularly. I lived on the border for years. And while there are some cultural difficulties that arise, especially for property owners in Dearborn, residents of Dearborn, non-Muslim residents of Dearborn, are not fearing for their lives. Most American Muslims are what you would call, quote, moderate Muslims. Now, that's a funny thing to say because I don't want anybody calling me a moderate Catholic. But the point is, you have to get to know a person. A person is created by God before they adopt any particular religion. And so we always try to meet people at the point of our common humanity. So I would suggest that, again, I have to say from personal experience, I have no fear of talking with Muslims. So please keep that in mind. It's an easy conversation. They often pray 5 times a day. So one way to start conversation is saying, well, I can see that you pray quite a bit. I pray as well. And then just share a little bit about it. Maybe show them a rosary, because Muslims have a great respect for the Blessed Virgin Mary. Believe it or not, they have a very high view of her, sometimes a higher view than some Protestants have. So I would suggest that you use the rosary to create conversation. You also have books that you can share. Nabil Qureshi's book, for instance, Looking for Allah, Finding Jesus, is a book I would suggest that if you get to the place in your conversation, you can ask them to read it. And you can read something from them as well. It should be a free interchange. You can ask them about Jesus at some point. And then you can also go into the issues about jihadist philosophy and Islamism and all that stuff. You can ask them if they would like to see a government governed by Sharia law, a state governed by Sharia law. You ask them do they think there should be a law forbidding conversions. You can ask them their view of women. You can ask them about whether missionaries should be free to preach the gospel in Saudi Arabia like they're free to preach it in the United States of America or in France. When we talk about global jihadism, that's being led by a particular type of Muslim. It is well grounded in Islam, but the Islamic world is like the Catholic world. You have people who are saints, you have those who are slackers, you have those who are pray often, in fact, those who pray not at all. You have those who are zealous, and you have those who just are lax. So get to know the person as a person first. You have nothing to fear, all right? If they felt they had a personal obligation to engage in jihad, you'd be dead by now, okay?
But they really don't respond. They don't ask you about your faith.
Yeah, I'm glad you point. That's a very good point. You may note that they never ask you about your faith. In other words, there's no reciprocity there.
Right.
Then forget about it. You're not developing a friendship. They think they're feeding you material to lead you to Islam. So if there's no reciprocity, you don't have a friendship, all right?
Okay, next up we have Kathy, who emailed, I'm a Presbyterian, strongly leaning to the Catholic Church, which I've been attending since this past November. For some reason, maybe God's mustard seed, I have a Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. I asked our Presbyterian interim pastor to explain the difference in this understanding. I felt he got quite defensive and told me that Christ only had to die once, and that the Presbyterian view is that it's merely a representation of his body and blood. Could you please help me understand why the Presbyterians do not believe the same as Catholics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, your pastor is right in that Christ did die once for all historically. And the Mass is not a re-sacrifice of Christ. It's a representation of that once for all sacrifice on Calvary. So he misunderstands the Catholic teaching on this. He might have gotten defensive because a lot of Presbyterians today aren't really Calvinist in their understanding of the Lord's Supper, or what we would call the Eucharist. They actually have a Zwinglian understanding. Zwingli was an earlier reformer than Calvin, who taught that the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, was just a memorial. There was nothing present there. No, you just had the symbols. You didn't have any real presence. Calvin had an entirely different understanding of the Lord's Supper. In fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to just look at a few notes here from Calvin. Calvin believes that it is in fact a real means of grace. Doesn't believe in transubstantiation, but believes that in fact there's a real reception of the body and blood of Jesus in the ordinance or the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. It's a spiritual presence, but it's a real presence. And let me just quote from his Institutes, one of the most important theological documents in Western history. If anyone should ask me how this partaking of the whole Christ takes place, I shall not be ashamed to confess that it is a secret too lofty for either my mind to comprehend or my words to declare. I rather experience than understand it. And that's in the Institutes, Part 4, 1732. So you really are much closer to the Catholic understanding of the Eucharist, and I would welcome you in the full communion. Would love to talk with you about it, so write me, give me a call, or go to your local priest and see what we can do to receive you in the full communion. But welcome. It'd be great to have you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Kathy in Cape Coral, Florida says, what about the Polish priest who came out as gay just before the Synod on families? The media played as though it was a significant moment, exposing growing fissures in the church between reformists and conservatives. Do you think the church is as divided as the media portrays in regards to the family? If so, what are we to do?
Kathy, let me say that this 43-year-old Polish priest who came out as gay the day before the Synod was trying to make a point, obviously. Yeah. He was a worker, an assistant on the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He was a theology teacher, and he, in fact, had a partner that he lived with. So here was a guy who was lobbying. This was a guy who was living outside of his vows. And guess what? The very next day, he was removed from his position. Some newspapers said he became an ex-priest. Well, no, that isn't what happens. He doesn't become an ex-priest, but he was relieved of his duties. And he wasn't relieved of his duties because he had homosexual orientation or that he was same-sex attracted. Father Lombardi said he was released from his duties because, in fact, let me read it for you here. He was released from his duties for making such a pointed statement on the eve of the opening of the Synod. It is very serious and irresponsible, since it aims to subject the Synod Assembly to undue media pressure. And he, of course, wasn't living by his vows of celibacy. So the church came down very hard. If there were a whole bunch of homosexual activists, waiting to push something through, he wouldn't have been slammed like that. It was like playing whack-the-mole. Pop, bang, he's gone. Now, there are differences among the bishops, the cardinals, regarding two things. How to best minister to those Catholics who are civilly divorced and remarried, and is there any possible way of restoring them to full Eucharistic sharing? Everybody agrees that marriage is indissoluble, and that as long as the person you were married to remains alive, you are living in a type of adultery if you've remarried and aren't living celibately. And as far as homosexuality goes, honestly, don't be afraid. The question is, as widespread as homosexuality is, around the world it's becoming institutionalized in civil unions or marriages. The only real question is, how can we best bear witness to Christ's teaching here? How can we be welcoming and accompanying? There's no doubt in my mind that homosexual couples, so-called marriages, homosexual marriages, will not be receiving the Eucharist. I have to say this so often that I find myself almost sputtering. The Church's teaching is clear. Relax. We have some pastoral decisions to make, but don't worry about it.
Yeah. There's about 2 weeks left in the Synod, and I'm sure a lot's going to come up, so I want to urge people to stay tuned to Cresta in the afternoon and not get freaked out when they hear things in the media, even the Catholic media.
Well,
a lot of reactionaries out there.
I like to point out, back in 1966, the Dutch bishops issued a catechism. I don't know if I said this earlier in the broadcast, but the Dutch bishops issued a catechism, 1966, that was full of so many problems that it was pulled. And you can read all the theological problems there. Okay. So my guess is that most of our listeners aren't even aware that there was this controversy at that time. Today, of course, everybody and his mother who has an interest in things religious would be commenting on the Dutch bishops and how heretical they are. Yeah. Well, they might be heretical, but guess what? They're not teaching us. All right? Okay.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned to Cresta in the afternoon, 4 to 6 Eastern Time every single day, where we delve into some of these issues. And we want you to participate in free-range Q&A. Send your questions to Facebook, Twitter, and freerange@avemariaradio.net. That's freerange@avemariaradio.net. Al is never chicken to answer any of your questions, so put them up there.
Okay.
Facebook, Twitter, and freerange@avemariaradio.net. Thanks, Al.
Thanks, Nick.
We'll see you next time. Okay. And welcome to this episode of welcome to the
You don't always recognize what's going on behind the scenes, but this is part of it.
Boom.